real pleasure to be here. As Zephyr just mentioned, it's the first time that an introduction turned into a roast. but we're grateful for the thorough introduction. I'm not going to go back quite as far historically as Professor Teachout will, but I will go back about 30 years to somebody who will remember this if I mention it, the Parking Violations Bureau of New York City, in which there was a great scandal in the mid-1980s. This is the last term of Ed Koch's administration as mayor. Stanley Friedman, the Democratic Party chair of the Bronx, Meade Esposito, the Democratic chair of Brooklyn, were both convicted on corruption charges related to the allocation of $23 million to a firm owned by Friedman called City Source. This was also called the City Source scandal, for a handheld traffic ticket computer that did not exist. A third Democratic Party chair, Donald Maness of Queens, was also implicated in the scheme. Mayor Koch said, "I am shocked so often at City Hall press conferences during this period that Murray Kempton suggested it should be made the city's motto." The key actors in this drama, in addition to the mayor and the convicted political bosses, were U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan, Southern District of New York, Rudy Giuliani, and U.S. District Judge Whitman Knapp, who was named looms large in anti-corruption circles, also the New York Police Department scandals. These scandals were very serious, but I think no more serious than the convictions won last year by the current U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. However, something really does differentiate the two eras of corruption. In the late 80s, the legislature and the city council got very active very fast after the Parking Violations Bureau scandals, passing a raft of new public integrity protections. That's quite clearly not what's happened this time around. If you follow the negotiations the last few days, no ethics reforms. There are a lot of reasons for the difference, but let me complicate the discussion by suggesting that a major reason for the current inaction is that 30 years ago, the missiles launched by the reform movement either hit the wrong target or none at all. That's a little bold claim, so I can explain that. When heightened expectations of reform are frustrated, and the conviction of over 20 members of the legislature in the past few years, including its leadership, I think indicates the inefficacy of these 1980s reforms, well, the public will become disappointed, and I think more dangerously, the public will become disaffected. So the response to the next scandal may often be a shrug. The 1980s reforms were not bad ideas, but they were designed to pick the low-hanging fruit. And more importantly, show that state lawmakers, including the governor, were doing something, pushing out laws whether they were effective or not. The hearings, press conferences, and signing ceremonies gave the impression of statecraft, whether there was any real difference made to public ethics. The reform laws focused largely on conflicts of interest by requiring all appointed state officials at that time, and legislators as well, and even some civil servants, to file lengthy public financial disclosure forms. The review and auditing of these forms that did occur was rather cursory. Quid pro quo relationships between contractors, lobbyists, campaign contributors, and lawmakers were essentially unrecorded and unexplored. I did an annual perusal of the disclosure forms filed by a sampling of legislators, including the leadership, over the past decade. It's apparent that the forms were not taken too seriously. There was very little or no detail in them about the sources of income, listed very broadly as fee-for-service in many cases. And that's what happens, I think, when there's no effective sustained oversight and therefore little effective deterrence. The ethics reform most recently, in 2011, created the Joint Commission on Public Ethics. Unfortunately, it's armed with even less ammunition than its predecessor agencies in terms of budget and staffing. If the current regime of ethics rules and anti-corruption regulations is not working, well, what should we or can we do that might be better? I'd like to propose a much broader definition of corruption as a way to get us thinking about and acting on broader significant causes of bad governance. The definition of political corruption that's most often cited by scholars and practitioners is private gain from public office. That's the one we're most used to. This is certainly something worthy of our approbation. I would not favor ignoring instances of nest feathering. However, I think it's very narrow. It doesn't cover abusive or oppressive use of law enforcement, neglect or willful ignorance of harmful financial, medical, or educational practices, and it doesn't include the massive influence of corporate and special interest financing of electoral campaigns. Almost all of this behavior is legal, but I would argue corrupt. To build and understand a new definition, let's start with some basic democratic theory. One way or another, theoretical writings on just governance by people like Michael Sandel, John Rawls, and Mark Warren are based on the notion of inclusion. Inclusion in the decision-making process of those most likely to be affected by a public decision. This, of course, applies to representative government generally, but it should also apply to ordinary regulatory functions of government, functions that have decisive consequences for people's lives. When reports of child sexual abuse came to the attention of public officials in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and too many other places here and abroad, officials told victims that their government would respond. But the response, we now know, was to negotiate with the church hierarchy, continuing and tolerating the abuse, to the exclusion of victims and the church laity, who would eventually find themselves mired in a horrible scandal that bankrupted a number of dioceses and undercut the moral authority of the institutional church for many. Mark Warren calls this duplicitous exclusion, and it is corrupt. The Black Lives Matter movement and a number of criminologists have pointed to the exclusion of minority citizens from the making of policing policy in many jurisdictions as another example of official behavior that is legal but corrupt. We can look at proven litigated examples of racial profiling by the New Jersey and Maryland State Police, or by the Ferguson Police Department, or closer to home, the response made by Michael Bloomberg and Ray Kelly during the height of stop and frisk in New York City that blacks were being understopped, to use their phrase, according to their overrepresentation in the population of suspects identified by witnesses and victims of violent crime. However, it must be pointed out that only 30% of stops were initiated by such identifications. So through a process that Diane Vaughan calls normalization of deviance, the original goal of stop and frisk, of getting guns off the street, was displaced by racialized suspicion of criminality. Well, let's bring this broader definition of corruption back to Albany and apply it to that part of the charge against former Speaker Sheldon Silver having to do with funds paid to Dr. Robert Tao. That payment of $500,000, a discretionary research grant made by Silver, came from an annually replenished $15 million fund for legislative health priorities. That was part of the 1999 Health Care Reform Act. It was put in the budget by three men in a room, Silver, Governor Pataki, and Senate Majority Leader Joe Bruno, and was designed to offset an even larger executive branch discretionary fund for health care reform. One of the few people to raise questions about this at the time was our colleague, Blair Horner, who was quoted by WNYC as saying about the health care negotiations that, quote, lots of things were happening and almost all of it was outside the public view, end quote. During Elliott Spitzer's tenure as governor, the Speaker's health care slush fund was shut down. However, Mr. Silver found a number of other ways to keep Dr. Traub happy and his patients flowing from the law firm to the law firm that was paying Silver for referrals. Well, if Spitzer turned off the spigot, maybe that's a bright spot in the story. Then you have to read the Citizens Union's 2015 report entitled Spending in the Shadows. I highly recommend this to you. The New York State fiscal year 2016 budget includes 66 lump sum pots of money, totaling approximately $2.6 billion, which is close to the entire annual budget of the city of Dallas, discretionary fund. The exclusion of the people of New York from decisions about the use of very large amounts of their money closely fits this broader definition of corruption. It can be seen at this point that the corrupt use of public office is, often for reasons more subtle than private gain. The Citizens Union report provides insight into the way control over money is used to shore up institutional position and demonstrate authority. These effects tend toward personal gain, but they have wider systemic impact that blocks certain kinds of policies and enables others. Again, giving those already at the table the loudest voices. Okay, well, is there a way out of this? I think actually a good model of what we might do is proposed by Kenneth Colt Davis. He's not talking specifically about the Catholic Church or some police departments or what's going on in Albany. He talks about, though, the inevitably select enforcement of the law that all police departments have to engage in. He argues that any kind of policymaking that allows discretionary action to be used that has an impact on people's lives should be subject to the transparent process of notice, comment, hearing, and publication that is required by the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs federal agency rulemaking. Well, the Administrative Procedure Act is highly formal, and there are exceptions to it, but by and large, I would say that it works. Moving to a more inclusive, transparent process of policy formulation must be a priority, I would argue, alongside post facto investigations and prosecutions. Thank you very much.